maybe President Trump is not talking about the climate benefits, but in effect, that is going to have profound climate benefits. I would argue maybe even more than gathering at COP every year and inking new deals and promises. So in practice, I think that there could be significant benefits, even though they are not touted as the goal of his policies.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore biodiversity conservation and the environment more broadly and interrogate conventional wisdom for the sake of a more robust case for conservation. I'm your host, Andre Mada. America's re-election of Donald Trump has brought about all manner of changes in US and global politics. Some of these changes have a direct effect on the environment, and then there are others that may be more indirectly consequential. The media, it seems, has reacted mostly with horror and predictions of disastrous consequences. And there's probably any number of commentators willing to echo those sentiments on a podcast. It might be more interesting, though, and more informative to hear the voice of a less critical environmentalist. Quill Robinson is Assistant Director and Associate Fellow of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a Washington, D.C.-based think tank. He was a guest on the podcast 3 years back and was kind enough to accept another invitation to weigh in on this particular topic. Soon after the recording, and by complete coincidence, Quill visited Japan for the first time as part of a US delegation to discuss nuclear energy. I'm based in Japan, so the visit gave us the opportunity to meet for the first time and stroll around Tokyo for a few hours, discussing a couple of things that we missed in the recording. We focused on the recent closure of the United States International Development Agency, USAID. Quill has friends who lost their jobs as a result of this move, and so he's given it considerable thought. Stick around until the end where I summarize what he has to say on that matter. But back in the interview, I began by asking Quill for his general views on the approach of the Trump presidency.
Energy has really been the focus of this incoming administration, and it featured very, very prominently on the campaign trail. Clearly, President Trump sees unleashing American energy as absolutely fundamental to his agenda. And, digging down a little bit deeper, I think he sees it as very closely linked to restoring the economy from his perspective, that cheap and abundant energy is essential to make America economically competitive and to beat inflation and so on and so forth. For him, I think that's, when he talks about unleashing American energy, that means primarily fossil energy. So that's kind of the rhetoric, right? He's going to bring about the American Golden Age. That's the way he's dubbed it. And drill, baby, drill is essential to that. But we're also living in a different world. It's a very different context from when he first entered office in January of 2017. A lot has happened in the energy and climate and conservation space. And obviously presidents have a lot that they can do, but there are exogenous factors and sort of macro trends. And that's something that I've been paying attention to and trying to compare and contrast as well. I mean, just thinking about energy in particular and what's changed in that time. I mean, at that time, we were the largest producer of natural gas in the world. But since he first took office, we've become the largest producer of oil in the world. In 2018 and 2019, we became a net energy exporter, which is very, very significant because the U.S. had been a net energy importer since the mid 1950s. So that's a very significant change. 15, 20 years ago, we were talking about peak oil and we were thinking about energy dependence and the geopolitics of that in the context of the Middle East. We were building liquefied natural gas import terminals. And now, since 2023, the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world. So a lot has happened since President Trump first took office. In many respects, we are quite energy dominant. He talks a lot about restoring energy dominance, and I think in many ways we are. Perhaps, I guess I would interpret his criticism of the Biden administration of, while production has increased under President Biden, there was it wasn't quite clear what the Biden administration's message was. And At times they seemed hostile to U.S. oil and gas. The lease sales for oil and gas production were a record low. At the same time, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, President Biden used that resource of U.S. LNG to really help keep Europe's economy humming, and he used that as a geopolitical tool. So I think the critique that Trump was leveling against Biden was that he was not as clear and bullish on American fossil fuels as he should have been. But I think the big question right now, when it comes to energy, when it comes to fossil production, which remains 80% of our energy system and 80% of the global energy system, is how much can, obviously the rhetoric is much more bullish on fossil, but like how is that going to actually change production numbers? And I think that remains to be seen. That's like, Andre, that's one piece of macro context that I would look at.
And cool. Sorry to butt in, but I just wanted to mention, I mean, you and I are both really familiar with this, but this issue that natural gas, although it's a fossil fuel, it's a much cleaner and better fossil fuel than the fossil fuel alternatives, right? And so this is something which I think you might have even mentioned it the last time we spoke, 3 years ago, this fact that by switching from coal and oil to natural gas where possible, America has managed to reduce emissions, I think, I'm not sure in terms of percentage, but in terms of quantity, more than any other country has ever been able to. Am I overstating that?
In absolute terms, I'm pretty sure that is correct. There was a DOE study, I think the time frame was 2005 to 2017, that the U.S. reduced its greenhouse gas emissions somewhere between 12 and 15%, which is not the largest percentage reduction of any country, but in absolute terms, that was the largest reduction of country. And the DOE clearly identified coal to gas switching primary driver of those emissions reductions. And so, yeah, I mean, not all fossil fuels are created equal from from an environmental perspective. Obviously, there's like NOx and SOx and all sorts of other, particulate matter and other sort of negative externalities from coal in particular. But then also in the climate context, I think there is a pretty clear case that natural gas is much cleaner, typically half the greenhouse gas emissions is coal burning, and a lot of the world still uses coal. So yeah, there is a pretty strong case that coal to gas switching is a net climate benefit.
And then that uncertainty that you were hinting at there, I guess the issue there is that under a Trump administration, fossil fuel producers kind of know what they're going to get, right? And under the Biden administration, they weren't quite sure, if there was another Democrat term, then policies might have become less friendly toward them, right? But I guess like the question then would be, I mean, is that a bad thing? I mean, should the US not be embracing green energies or alternative energies more fully than they are? Or do you think this focus on natural gas is really at least the short to medium term answer in terms of reducing emissions?
Well, I think we should look at what the Biden administration's theory of change was. I think they realized, looking back at the last decade of attempted climate policy, the really important marker was the 2009, 2010, 2011 period, where there was the first effort to do sweeping climate policy under President Obama here in the United States. There was the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill that ultimately failed. It's a market-based mechanism to address climate change. Ultimately failed. Very long history. We don't nearly have time to to go into all the details about why that happened, but I think there was a realization on the part of climate advocates and Democratic lawmakers who wanted to pass climate policy that the economists' preferred choice for addressing climate change didn't necessarily have the political constituency or popularity. And so President Biden came in 2021 with a tremendous amount of youth support. Climate change was something he talked a lot about on the campaign trail. And I would also note that like gas prices were relatively low at that time. It wasn't a period of where Americans were feeling energy prices acutely, which I think is an important condition as well. So anyways, President Biden comes in, and I think the theory of change here was that rather than doing cap and trade or carbon tax or something like that, they were going to align the decarbonization goal with two other national goals: de-risking from China and reindustrialization. And so that was sort of like the three-legged stool of the IRA was decarbonization, de-risking from China, and reindustrialization. And they wanted to simultaneously address all three of those things. And they spent a lot of money doing it, and created tax credits and grant programs and some regulations, but primarily spending money to try to reshore clean energy manufacturing, and then on the supply side and then on demand side, creating a lot of incentives to encourage this deployment. It's been estimated that the spend over 10 years for the IRA would be anywhere between 700 billion and a trillion. So like a lot of money, largest climate spend in history. And they saw it was pretty slow. Like it did not yield the results that I think that they'd hoped for as quickly as they had wanted. And I think that President Trump's critique, like obviously we know he doesn't like wind turbines and that sort of thing, but I think there's like a really interesting nuanced critique here that China makes 80% of the world's solar panels. They do it very well. They've been doing the industrial policy thing for 2 decades now. Same with EVs, same with wind turbines, same with batteries, all these categories of clean energy technologies that are so important to the energy transition. They have the advantage on when it comes to these clean energy technologies. We should do what we know best and use the resources that we have under our feet. I think that is Trump's instinct, is that climate change is not as high of a priority for him. He's very much thinking about our economic competitiveness and the geopolitical nature of energy. We have the energy resources here under our feet. We are going to develop them. We're going to yield the economic benefit. We're going to reap the economic benefits, and we're going to use geopolitical power.
And I guess that in the long term, ideally in the long term, the US would continue R&D in solar and wind and other green energies, while just continuing to try to produce the cleanest fossil fuel possible, right? I guess that would be the more or less the strategy.
Yeah, it's a live question right now. I mean, we're in the throes of the debate over the future of the Inflation Reduction Act right now. I think because President Trump won the popular vote, Republicans have control of the House and the Senate. They feel a very strong mandate. 8-10 months ago, a lot of people were talking about, Republicans are going to use a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer when it comes to the IRA. I think they are quite emboldened to fully rebuke the Biden climate agenda and legacy, given the outcome of the election. So I think there's a very aggressive effort to roll it all back right now. We'll see how that plays out. There's all the stuff around reconciliation, and I don't think the solidarity of the Republican Party is going to increase in the coming months. It's probably going to dissipate a little bit. So we'll see how that actually plays out. But to your question about the future of the manufacturing these technologies, industrial policy is kind of a dangerous game, right? Like there are very compelling reasons to not want to be dependent on China for these technologies. But then there is the question of how much cost are we incurring if we are trying to build up these industries domestically? The price of a Chinese and American solar panel there's a pretty big spread there. And if you're talking about EVs, BYD sells $10,000 EVs, and the average new car in the US is like $50,000. That's quite the spread. So I think that if you were just optimizing for decarbonization, we would just buy the Chinese EVs or buy the Chinese solar panels. But under this administration, the China de-risking looms very large, and decarbonization is not a top priority.
Yeah, so geopolitics versus the environment in a case like that. Just one quick question about the IRA, and I'm not sure how much you know about the detail, but in practice, what would it mean to roll back the Inflation Reduction Act? So would a good example be shuffling of subsidies, the way that subsidies are allocated to different industries, or what would be one or two of the main features of rolling it back?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate or discussion right now of what is the top target. Like the IRA is a whole bunch of different subsidies and grant programs. Obviously, grant programs that have already distributed money, it's going to be very difficult to pull that money back. But many of those grant programs, which have a heavy dose of environmental justice and DEI that was infused by the Biden administration, certainly those are not continuing. When it comes to the tax credits, It's an interesting one. Like the EV tax credit is something that President Trump criticized heavily on the campaign trail. This is the $7,500 consumer tax credit when you go out and buy an EV that's on a qualifying list that, has a certain amount of domestic parts and so on and so forth. That is very unpopular among Republicans. The way that they would characterize it is that the American taxpayer is subsidizing some rich Californian second car. I would point out that from a decarbonization perspective, there's been studies on electric vehicle tax credits that find that you're looking at somewhere in the order of $300 to $400 per ton per carbon abated, which makes carbon capture look cheap. So even from a decarbonization perspective, I don't find EV tax credits that compelling. At the same time, transportation is the largest, source of, so there's an interesting interplay there. Then there's also the investment tax credit and production tax credit for electricity, which interestingly under the IRA was being transitioned to technology neutral, including nuclear, which is something that is popular among Republicans. That's a big ticket item. Republicans are very critical of subsidizing wind and solar technologies they would characterize as mature technologies that we've already subsidized heavily. And the question they would ask is, you say that they are so cheap, why do we need to continue to subsidize them? I don't really have a sense of, what direction that goes. There's sort of conflicting interests there. But certainly the investment and production tax credit are big ticket items. Mm-hmm. Then there's also tax credits for the manufacturing of clean energy technologies. And I think this is the really interesting piece. 45X and 48C were instrumental in standing up domestic solar production, battery production, so on and so forth. Of the the green industrial policy we hear about, not as expensive as ITC and PTC, but there's this, it's a very interesting one, right? Like, do Republicans' dislike of subsidizing solar outweigh their like of having a new manufacturing plant in their Georgia congressional district? I don't know. And certainly there are many Republicans who've warmed up to the idea of industrial policy as well. If you look back at J.D. Vance's career and his particular flavor of conservatism, he is not a Hayekian, free market, free trade Republican of yore. He is very much interested and supportive of industrial policy, whether that includes clean energy technologies or not.
Mm-hmm. You see a lot of these sort of panicked headlines in the media these days about what the consequences of Trump's presidency are going to be for a whole host of different issues, like from biodiversity to climate. But just generally speaking, do you think that, okay, he's only been in office for a few weeks now. It's early days, but there have been this flurry of executive orders. There are probably more to come. But generally speaking, are there particular policy areas that you think, environmental policy areas that you think might be benefited by his presidency, that were previously perhaps overlooked or even harmed by previous policies? And I'm thinking, for example, in terms of things like, with the California wildfires, if there had been, and we know that this is not the only issue involved, but if there had been stronger policies regarding forest maintenance, for example, the wildfires might not have been as severe as they were. So just as an example, but that kind of thing. Are there areas that you're sort of particularly bullish about when it comes to his presidency?
Well, I guess first of all, during Trump 1.0, climate change was not a top priority. There was a lot of, I would say, good work done by the Environmental Protection Agency, particularly on Superfund sites. That was a focus of the first Trump administration. They really cared.
Superfund sites.
Superfund sites. So these are areas that have experienced historic, significant pollution, not carbon pollution, but other types, often industrial areas or that sort of thing. And then it's not my area of expertise, but then, the government marshals resources to go in and clean up these areas. And so when it comes to, there was a lot of attention to like non-GHG related environmental harm, particularly in rural communities and former industrial communities that the first Trump administration did hone in on, and I think did good work. To your point about wildfires, I think this is another thing that has changed over the last few years. Is I think that there is a growing recognition, bipartisan recognition, that the government regulations can actually do environmental harm. That would be more of a Republican talking point and something that Democrats would balk at before. Obviously, the environmental movement of the 60s and the 70s, that was born out of rivers catching on fire and other types, pollution and harms like that, was very regulation focused. Republicans have been talking about like sort of unintended outcomes and perverse incentives when it comes to things like the Endangered Species Act for a while now, but I think particularly, I guess it's sort of in the context of climate change, but there's this whole conversation of permitting reform that's really exploded over the last couple of years. And there's been a realization among many like climate folks that the time it takes to do environmental reviews, often for like a clean energy project, is just untenable. And so there's something that is something needs to change about the status quo. And this is the case too when it comes to wildfires, that regulations and processes established by the government as they stand actually are causing harm by not allowing folks to come in and do the forest, the active forest management required to prevent these forest fires. And that's actually kind of an exciting thing to me, that there's a recognition on both sides of the aisle that there's red tape that needs to be cut. There are laws that need to be adjusted because they're doing more, in some cases, doing more harm than good. And so, hopefully that's an area of bipartisan collaboration in the coming years.
Do you think that, especially with the much discussed DOGE that's been set up, the explicit aim of that department is to, well, not necessarily deregulate, but to streamline government. Do you think that that's going to help a lot with just making it easier for things to happen? How do you see the role of DOGE? And also kind of what do you think will be the environmental consequences of DOGE, if any?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to predict where DOGE is going. It's a new thing. In the first couple of weeks, I think they've been very focused on spending and letting go of federal employees at departments or agencies that they see as not useful or counter to American interests, or that have been weaponized against conservatives. That seems to have been the primary focus in the first few weeks. Interestingly, the folks who have been appointed to run EPA, Lee Zeldin, Department of Interior, Doug Burgum, Department of Energy, Chris Wright, well, they're not consummate DC insiders. They don't quite have the personality of Elon Musk. They're not like moving fast and breaking things quite in the same style that he is. And they have deep, particularly Burgum and Wright, have deep experience with lands and energy issues. Certainly they may want to shake up the status quo, but I think their approach has been a bit more measured than DOGE. Maybe I'll have to eat my words on this, but I get the sense that, that these are sort of areas where there's a bit more stability than in the DOGE realm and what DOGE is focusing on.
Mm-hmm. I guess that part of the sort of characteristic of DOGE is that it's kind of like a bit of a maverick organization or branch, right? Yeah. That are pretty much given free rein to do what they want to do.
Certainly. And I think, amending pertinent laws that apply to these environmental energy issues that we're talking about, like the National Environmental Policy Act, there was an executive order on NEPA. Ultimately, I think it's going to take congressional action, though, if it's actually going to change the status quo. There's only so much that the executive branch can do in this regard, right? Like they can, starve agencies and programs of resources. They can say, go a little bit this way or go a little bit that way. But if we were to see a real paradigm shift from this system that has been halting necessary action, actions that are increasingly seen as necessary by people on both sides of the aisle, like building out clean energy projects and doing active forest management and that sort of thing. I think that's going to take congressional action. At the end of last Congress, there was a bill written by Joe Manchin and John Barrasso in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. This was sort of a compromise Democrat-Republican permitting reform bill. It did not ultimately pass, but I think it will require bipartisan action on the part of Congress if we really want to see a paradigm shift on this. Mm-hmm. But hey, I mean, DOGE is moving fast. Like who knows? Maybe energy environmental issues become DOGE's focus next. I really don't have any idea.
Right. Yeah. So far, as far as I know, energy and environment hasn't been a big part of their focus at all, right? Well, it certainly hasn't made the news, the headlines yet. More generally, the EPA, are they likely to face any kind of funding cuts or major changes in direction? Because, I mean, the EPA govern virtually all major environmental, at least domestic environmental decisions in the US, right? Environmental management and policy. So, do you know of any kind of challenges that they're about to face under the Trump administration?
Under the Biden administration, the regulatory power of the EPA was exercised. I think many would characterize it as hostile to the fossil fuel industry, to fossil electricity generation, power plant. There were power plant rules that went out. There was also a great deal of focus on environmental justice under Administrator Reagan, under the Biden administration, and the Trump administration has been very, very clear that diversity and equity and inclusion and environmental justice that is no longer a priority.
Can I
Um,
just interrupt you to ask what is meant by environmental justice?
that's a really, it's a really good question. It's one of those newfangled terms that I think many people have different opinions on. But my understanding, at least, is as we are considering environmental impacts, it is important that we recognize that historically marginalized communities have been disproportionately impacted by environmental harms. In practice, this meant that a lot of money was allocated to particular communities based on those sorts of assessments
Right.
made by the Biden administration. And, paradoxically, I think that there are rural communities that liberals might call environmental justice communities, and conservatives might be like, the forgotten man and women of America. But, certainly the nomenclature and the priorities and the way that the Biden administration went about it is out the door under the Trump.
But in terms of kind of just day-to-day conservation, thinking particularly about biodiversity here, do you think there'll be any major changes there, or is there anything stated to, for example, can the EPA expect to shrink in terms of staff size, or making any major changes in the way that they actually manage the environment?
To my knowledge, I think particularly the positions that were focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, environmental justice, those are probably being scrapped or not filled. It's not my area of expertise. I mean, I guess one thing I would say is another big story that is relevant here is the electricity demand growth. For the last 20 years, the United States electricity demand has been, basically flat. Some estimates say that in the next 5 years or so, we may see like up to a 14 or 15% increase, right? And that is a dramatic, dramatic change. And then that's largely driven by electrification, reindustrialization, and then, of course, AI and data centers, that being the most notable driver. That's important because in the context of the energy transition, which was already proving challenging in a flat demand scenario, now it's not only about transitioning the existing fleet, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions of the existing fleet. It's like, oh, now we have to like bring more and more power into the grid. And so that's another interesting one here, I think, because then it brings into question like, are we going to retire our coal fleet at the same pace that we thought we were? And that's something that's under EPA jurisdiction. Are we going to be building a lot more natural gas? Are renewables, given their intermittent nature and sort of the nascency of battery storage, are those going to be able to meet the needs? And so that I think that has profound implications, obviously in the energy domain, but also in terms of land use, and of course that's connected to biodiversity and the pollution regulation that the EPA does, and so on and so forth. So
Hmm.
that's an important story. I guess, Andre, like the other thing that I would say that I think is important for this administration is one of the defining battles in American environmentalism is what the country looks like east of the Mississippi and west of the Mississippi. I grew up in Washington State, west of the Mississippi, and in the west we have a lot of public land. In Nevada, 90% of the land is federally controlled. It's national parks, national forests, Bureau of Land Management. think Utah is something like 80%. Particularly the Mountain West is very heavily federally controlled. And that has long been a point of friction between the people who live there and then the people in Washington, D.C., who say what can and cannot happen on that land. Um, that is and that there has been a lot of friction over, like the Endangered Species Act, for example, like what happens if an endangered species comes onto your property. You don't want the feds to like come in, and that's what gave rise to this like shoot, shovel, and shut up. Like rather kill the animal and bury it, don't tell anybody about it, as opposed to alert it because you don't want to get the feds involved. So that is a really important dynamic exists. And the reason that I bring that up is that, President Trump and his administration, I think, are far more sympathetic to landowners and to the developers of natural resources in the West than the Biden administration was. And that is an enduring, defining battle when it comes to the environment in the United States.
Right. But as you alluded to there, that kind of regulatory tendency of the past, it can spur all sorts of negative unintended consequences, right? Whereas perhaps a less regulation-oriented environment would make it more likely that landowners would want to conserve their land. I mean, is that a little bit of a utopian way of looking at it?
I think how do you define conservation? A particular point of friction, like in Colorado, has been the reintroduction of the gray wolf. In Montana, the reintroduction of the grizzly has been another one. One can understand, reintroducing species that formerly ranged in these regions could be a biodiversity win. But for those whose flocks or families are experiencing predation by, these dangerous animals, they might have a very different perspective. And yeah, I think that's led to a lot of kind of swings back and forth in policy and certainly a lot of animosity.
Right. Just to kind of get back a little bit to a point I was hitting on earlier on, I was kind of wondering whether, famously Trump has now withdrawn, I'm not sure if it's official yet, but withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement. And I guess that there will be okay, US has never been a member of the Convention on Biological Diversity, but I guess there will be some other sort of global retractions and sort of more of a focus on national doings than international doings. But I guess that perhaps the positive way of looking at that would be that, I mean, from a conservation and environment point of view, it might be that that's a retraction from the global stage means better conservation at the local level. Is that also perhaps a utopian way of looking at things, or do you expect that to happen as well?
First off, yes, the Trump administration, he and the people around him, I think, are deeply, deeply skeptical of supranational organizations, of multilateralism. I think they feel that the U.S. has repeatedly gotten the short end of the stick, that we bear an undue burden when it comes to these sorts of agreements. I think that is a very important part of the worldview. Certainly, I think that the air got cleaner and the water got cleaner and greenhouse gas emissions did go down. And, by lots of different measures, there was progress under the first Trump administration. And, our trajectory generally as a country is good. We are sort of decoupling economic growth and environmental harms. Does it mean a greater focus on national outcomes? I guess in a sense, I think that at least when I listen to like what Lee Zeldin, the head of the EPA, was saying, I think there's a great, great focus on economic growth, on unleashing economic growth. And that does not necessarily mean an increase in environmental harms. But I don't think that the thing that is front of mind for this administration is how can we protect biodiversity? It is getting what they perceive as the barriers to unleashing American economic growth out of the way.
Right. And I guess one other sort of positive way of looking at that would be, a prosperous country is a country that can afford to look after its environment.
Right. The environmental Kuznets curve, right? Like once you reach a critical point of wealth and you're able to care about those things. Sure.
Cool. Just to end off, I wanted to just kind of repeat the opening question, and maybe you can sort of answer it in sort of a more or less a yes/no fashion, but, feel free to elaborate. But overall, especially comparing Trump's presidency and sort of what you expect from Trump's presidency, comparing that to what came before, 4 years of Democratic presidency and also Obama's before that, do you think that things are likely to be better or worse for the environment? And I know this is it's difficult to just black and white it like that, but what do you think? I mean, I know that as far as I know, you're still a Republican, right? But from an environmental point of view, are you still a Republican, or would you prefer to go back to a democratic state of mind with regard to the environment, where there is, a lot more, at least superficial, focus on preserving the environment in any way possible?
I think there is reason to be hopeful about this administration. I think the virtue of Trump, and I ask your listeners who are deeply skeptical of him, and maybe for good reasons, I think the virtue of Trump is he is very attuned to interests and deals and being straightforward and explicit. And I think that, well, to go back to our discussion of the Inflation Reduction Act, right, while trying to decarbonize, de-risk, and reindustrialize at the same time are all worthy goals, the goal of their policy through the IRA, they ended up doing a disservice to themselves and actually, doing some things that were ultimately counterproductive, and kind of left everybody unhappy. And the indication of that is the result of the election. There is virtue in saying we're going to unleash the American economy, and we are going to unleash American energy. It is clear and is explicit. It is a directional goal. I think there is benefit to that, and it does not preclude making progress in other domains. But I think that could be beneficial, right? We're going to produce a ton of natural gas here in the U.S., and we're going to export it around the world. And we should make that gas as clean as possible. And if we export it to Asia, which is going to represent East Asia, which is going to represent 60% of the increase in energy demand over the next couple of decades, and it's displacing coal, maybe President Trump is not talking about the climate benefits, but in effect, that is going to have profound climate benefits. I would argue maybe even more than gathering at COP every year and inking new deals and promises. So in practice, I think that there could be significant benefits, even though they are not touted as the goal of his policies. I have long been deeply skeptical of sort of aesthetic, rhetorical environmentalism, because I think it is often virtue signaling and rings hollow. And I am the environmentalism I trust, the conservation I trust, is the one that comes from what Roger Scruton termed oikophilia, love of home, that comes from that particular place that you are from, that you wish to conserve for future generations, not something that is abstract and about the other side of the world. And so my environmentalism, and I think it is a deeply small c conservative desire to conserve, comes from that place between Puget Sound and the Cascades where I grew up, and my desire to share that with my children. I think that is a very powerful environmental ethic.
Soon after this episode was recorded, the Trump administration's closure of USAID hit the news cycle. As mentioned, I had the chance to discuss this a bit with Quill during his serendipitous visit to Japan. His response can be summarized in the following points. Firstly, while important work was brought to an abrupt stop by this closure of USAID, so was a considerable amount of work that many Americans would, if they were aware of it, consider a waste of their dollars and or not representative of their values. Secondly, it appears that the Trump administration's view is that if the undesirable component of this work were cut, but the organization were allowed to continue, then that undesirable component would be bound to reemerge in future, especially if and when a new Democrat dispensation were to take over. There were also civil servants throughout the federal government that stated that they would work to undermine their executive orders, as they did during the first Trump presidency. Thirdly, a broader question is whether the governments of wealthy countries like the USA have an obligation to fund development in other countries. There are arguments for and against this perceived obligation of foreign aid. Quill provided one example of an against case from his hometown, Seattle, where nearly $1 billion was spent to address homelessness over the last decade, but with the result that the number of homeless individuals increased by 30% over that time. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. And sometimes people and nature can benefit most when the government stands aside rather than trying to choose the best options for development from a distance. Fourth and last, a broader argument against foreign aid, as elaborated by commentators like Zambian economist Dambisa Moyo, is that aid has a general net negative effect on recipient countries. For example, encouraging corruption and removing incentives for innovation and entrepreneurship. So time will tell what the consequences are of this major move by the Trump administration for global aid and for support of the administration itself. These are all topics that will be highly contentious and certainly deserving of their own dedicated discussions, perhaps also in future on this podcast.